Hey, welcome back everyone to the 8th and final session of the Keeping Sport Safe, Safe Sport Speaker Series presented by the Canadian Sports Centre Manitoba and Fit Women and Girls. We would firstly like to acknowledge that from our offices in Winnipeg, we are gathered on ancestral lands, Treaty 1 territory, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation, and for myself in Ottawa, on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. Tonight, we will be having a discussion around safe sport beyond policy, facilitated by Jeff and Sandi here. So Sandi Kirby, as we now all know, researcher and advocate for safe sport, works with Safe Sport International and international federations, officer of the Order of Canada, avid rower, all those great things. And then Jeff might be new to some. Jeff Powell is the executive director at the Canadian Sports Centre Manitoba, and he has helped immensely in working to implement safe sport, safe sport policies within our organization, but also going beyond that, which we will soon all learn. So yes, Jeff is an Olympic rower because, you know, we love rowers here at CSCM and with Fit Women and Girls, but he has been involved as an athlete and a coach at every level in sport. Through his career, he's been focusing on Olympic and Paralympic now at this pathway, but he recognizes that this piece is only healthy the whole system is. Jeff, I'm going to pass it along to you and Sandi now.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Jesse, and thank all of you for joining in this series over the last couple of weeks. I appreciate this is an awful lot of time in all of your very busy lives, and it's very meaningful to us that you've chosen to spend it with us over the last couple of weeks. So what we've done, or what we have tried to do, is to provide the framework, some of the language in the UCC, some of the reporting requirements, some of the bones that underlie a quality safe sport environment. And where we want to move is, how do we go from quality policy to quality action, to staff, to coaches, to parents, to officials, that are really able to action this on the field of play or in the daily training environment. And that's a little bit more the discussion we want to have today to wrap all this up. You know, I think most organizations are getting their policy house in order these days, and most organizations are familiar with their obligations under, say, reporting, for example. But where I sense that there's still some discomfort and some uncertainty is around fluency in this language, how we act when actions are not clearly illegal, and how we can go about increasing that culture in our organization, increasing that fluency, and developing the kind of lexicon that allows us to talk about all sorts of safe sport issues, because we've certainly covered a lot over the last couple of weeks. So as far as today's concerned, we're hoping to keep this very discussion oriented. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions, to discuss with some of the other folks on the call. We're going to start off with a little bit of a discussion about what readiness is as an organization, and how readiness and best practices work together to create the kinds of environments we hope to have. I wanted to share with all of you the journey that CSCM has been on over the last 5 or 6 years. Not to say that it is the way to do it, but to illustrate a way that we might move forward. And you are, of course, free to take whatever you think might work for your organization. A key part of that, though, is the kinds of discussions we've been having within our organization around the news of the day as it comes up. And unfortunately, there are far too many of these stories that hit the news, and how we as a staff and as an organization will talk about those. So Sandi and I are just going to, I don't want to say role play. We're going to have a very real discussion about a very real case that took place, just as a bit of an example. And then we have a couple of cases that Sandi has brought from her research. We're going to share with the group and give everyone an opportunity to go into some breakout rooms and have a small group discussion about what they see the issues being, how ready they think their organization would be to tackle it, and how they might go about prepping their staff if they were to be faced with these sorts of situations. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that you are interested in, I hope you'll join us. And again, this is meant to be much more free flowing, much more open for discussion. So I don't want to speak for Sandi, but I think we are very open to interruption and questions as we move forward here. But Sandi, perhaps I'll pass it over to you for the next little bit here.
Okay, thank you. So this is about readiness. Now, about 3 weeks ago at SSI, we were writing a final report on the project that we've been hired to do. And we were looking at the pathway of disclosure and reporting. And the pathway, started with when the abuse occurred. And then it went to when an athlete might speak out about it. And as we were talking about it, it was very clear that there was a huge gap between those 2 points. And so I came up with the idea of readiness, and it resonated really well. And so as SSI now, that is in that report. So this is only the second time it's ever been in print. So this is new stuff. When I mentioned the word to Jeff, he picked that up right away and said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm after. So readiness is about not necessarily knowing what to do, not necessarily knowing how to act or what to act on, sorry. But having the willingness to move, like that kind of, that sense that you need to move, so that readiness. So one of the essentials is, before we even start in sport, we have to know what the rights of children are. And that kind of helps our readiness. If we know what the rights are, and then we see something that's not right, then we're kind of well enough informed to be ready to do something about it. And I've listed the ones here for the Convention on the Rights of the Children, which you would have seen in my talk on Tuesday, some of that. Another thing that's part of the readiness is kind of being pre-prepared. So knowing what the types of abuse are. So knowing what physical abuse is, psychological abuse, neglect, and so on. There's a litany of them, but having a little bit of knowledge about them always helps with ready you can act. Having the words to act will help. And the third is to disabuse ourselves that that this person couldn't possibly be an abuser because they're such a good person, or this couldn't possibly be abuse because this person is so successful at what they do. To think that abusers can be anywhere, they can be anyone, and they can be our closest friends and our people who we've barely met. So that kind of readiness comes from probably these three things: knowing the rights of children, knowing the information about the abuse, and knowing that it can happen anywhere with anyone. So that's kind of where we go with readiness. And I hope it resonates with you. Anything you can do to be ready yourself, or readiness in your staff. And Jeff will talk a bit about that with his organization as well. Okay, next. And then this is just a primer on the best practices, things that we can keep top of mind for knowing that we're on the right path if we do these things. And part of this is that we can talk about best practices for individuals, but we want to move this to best practices about organizations as well. So translate these into organizational thinkings as well. Okay, so the first one, moving from policy to competency, and competency then amongst our staff. So I'm having trouble with this. There we go. It's always good when somebody phones you right in the middle of something. The second one is that we can do to help our organization be ready is the risk assessment. In this case, identifying the context in your sport where the abuse might occur. Like, where are the gaps? What can we do to be better prepared? Not that we're expecting abuse, but to ensure that it's not there. The third one is, if something doesn't seem right, it's worth your attention. Like there is a nip it in the bud kind of thing here. And that's typically what the gray zone is identified as this. Things don't seem right. Your intuition tells you that, your gut feeling tells you that this isn't quite right. The next one is, and I talked about this on Tuesday, but don't be an enabler, someone who funnels children towards someone who's known or suspected to be an abuser, or to have abusive patterns, or is likely to harm them, or a bystander. And the bystander is more common. This is, I see, but I don't see. I see it. I heard that swearing on the tarmac, but I'm just going about my business, carrying my boat and going to row. We should stop it. At that point, it's small, it's easy. See it, name it, stop it. Next one is treat a child as a child and then as an athlete. Don't treat them as an athlete first. Treat them as a child first, who has parents and siblings, or maybe no parents and or maybe no siblings, I don't know, but understand something of their life context. This discussed regularly with the rights of children. Lots of people are talking about contracts with children, parents, and coaches before seasons start. I think those are quite helpful. Stay within your training, like in terms of my readiness. You know, I'm a variety of things in sport, but as I'm here today, I'm speaking as a researcher and an expert. So I have to stay within my expertise and not go off and say, you know, well, I really think, you know, this about this. You know, I have to speak from within my sphere of training, and a coach should coach from within their sphere of training and not try to be other things as well. Right. So that's a good model, is stay within your sphere. And the last one is just basic good practice, is about asking children regularly and meaningfully about how they're feeling in sport. You could easily translate this into organizational language. Ask your staff, ask your colleagues regularly and meaningfully how they are feeling about the workplace or how they're feeling about the work they're doing. So all of these things will help with a sense of readiness, but also kind of priming the pump. So if anything happens, you're on the mark right away, hopefully when something is quite small. Okay,
Sandi,
so go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had a question for you on this. And I think it's this kind of staying within your scope and when discussions are inappropriate or appropriate. And you and I know, have talked about that we always want to, most actions are appropriate if they are in the interests of the child, the athlete, the person without the power. And we also know that when people are in vulnerable situations, they are more at risk of being taken advantage of. And so I wonder always about, you know, the child lets on that mom and dad are separating, right? And I could see a caring adult asking how they are doing with that, right? But I could also see that as being very much an opening for someone with very different set of intentions to take advantage of that person. So how do we judge, or how do we explore those kinds of issues without sort of, I don't want to say assuming the worst, but without making it out to be the worst in every case?
It's a tricky one because you never know. I mean, it's not like people with nefarious motives, you know, pop right out at you and say, oh, well, there's one with a nefarious motive and there's a good one. It's not like that. But so from the athlete's perspective, if they're feeling vulnerable and somebody's asking in a caring way about them, they're responsive to that. For the person who's asking, the border is when you ask about whether you're caring, whether there's anything you can do to help this child, or when you volunteer to take care of this child. That's usually the switch. There's one where there's a little bit of power over that's asserted instead of, how are you doing? Is there any way I can help? Can I contact someone on your behalf? Can I, without stepping in and saying, okay, come, I'll take care of you. You know, you and I can discuss this maybe in my home or something like that. So you can see the response in whether there's a power insertion in there. If you are part of the conversation and you hear it. Yeah. For the athlete, it's whether the athlete feels safe. At some point, they're not going to feel safe. They're going to feel like they might not be harmed, but they're going to feel unsafe at some point. So one of the things we can do is talk to the athletes and say, if you feel even remotely unsafe, let's start talking about it. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Shall we slide on here, Sandi?
Sure.
Okay. So again, I wanted to share this journey with the group just to share a way that this can take place within an organization. I certainly do not pretend that this has gone in a straight line for us. But what I am confident in saying is that it is a staff now that is very fluent in the language of safe sport, is comfortable talking about a variety of issues, and is confident to address them when they come up. So if we think that that is a useful endpoint, I just wanted to share how we went about getting there. And quite frankly, it really started, and those of you who are more familiar perhaps with the national sports scene will recall that in 2015, Marcel Abou, who was the CEO of the Canadian Olympic Committee, ended up, I think, leaving by mutual agreement when a number of allegations of sexual and emotional harassment occurred under his, I want to say leadership, but that might not be the correct term. And so recognizing that this was an issue in sport, we had a sort of an initial meeting with our staff, and it was a bit challenging. There were some tears. I will be very honest, that I found it very awkward as kind of the leader of the organization. And what I learned out of that conversation was partly that I'd been very naive. I mean, I certainly was not naive to the fact that women in sport would be subject to sexual harassment. What I was naive to was its prevalence. And what I was even more naive to is that in 100% of the cases where women in our organization had experienced some sexual harassment at some point in their careers, those organizations had policies, dispute resolution, harassment, code of conduct, those sorts of policies. In 100% of the cases, the women were aware of the policies and knew what avenues were open to them. And in 100% of the cases, they did not avail themselves of the mechanisms provided by those policies. And so for me, that was it was a very clear statement that policy in and of itself is woefully insufficient to address safety in the workplace and safety in sport more broadly. And so, but that began a period over the last 5 or 6 years where the staff has got together regularly and repeatedly to discuss current issues in the news, right? And sadly, there are no shortage of them, to conduct formal training, to discuss both things that are real and occurring in the sports system and hypotheticals that have come up. And I think one of the key elements in having those discussions, and is if you try to have these in yours, is it's very critical at the outset to make clear that we all have permission to not say it quite right? Many of us are learning this for the first time. We grew up in a very different sports system, and in order for people to feel free to share their thoughts, their emotions, how they might act in a certain circumstance, we need to give them permission to not use quite the right word all the time, just to let the conversation flow a bit more. And so with that as kind of the underlying principle, this is now a combination of very formal training. So everyone on staff, as an example, has taken the Commit to Kids module with the Center for Child Protection, and that is athlete facing and back office staff, right? Back of house staff. Not because I will necessarily have a lot of interactions with the athletes directly, but because it's important for me to have some fluency in the kinds of issues, the kind of language that will be used when and if a staff member encounters these sorts of behaviors. And it also allows the entire organization to talk about it. The other thing that has been tremendously rewarding for me, and I'm very proud of the staff, is, in particular, younger staff take real ownership over, I mean, they have a real desire to move this piece forward. And some of what we have done has very much been at staff direction. It has not needed to be top down, right? So we have a young fellow on staff who's really taken on board some of the policy writing. He's got an interest in it. He certainly has an ability for it. And I would not underestimate the degree to which you will have people in your organization for whom this is a great priority. I know within our COPSN group, which is the national body that provides a lot of the sports sciences services, when I talk to the presidents, they are often getting pushed from their people, particularly in the DEI space now. And so don't underestimate the willingness of staff to drive this, right, and to be part of this. And I can't emphasize this enough, that I think that our staff comfort and fluency in discussing these issues has an enormous impact on their ability to deal with them early and quickly and effectively, right? So Sandi referenced nipping things in the bud, and I know that our staff has become very, very good at bringing back to the larger group, hey, listen, saw this interaction, heard this conversation, read this piece. What do we think? What are we going to do about it, right? And it's been, I think, very, very effective, and it's allowed us to have, I think, some very deep conversations and consider some much more impactful programming options and how we might go about supporting usually athletes, but quite frankly, anyone who finds themselves in these situations. So what I wanted to do then is, given this as the background and my belief that some of these conversations, which are hard, do a great job of developing this fluency, is we'd like to have a few of them with this group. So there's just, so Sandi and I will model, I don't model, we're going to have a real one first. I don't know how good a model we're going to be, Sandi, but we'll try. We're going to have a bit of a discussion between us about a particular case. And then there'll be an opportunity. Sandi will share a couple that have come up through her research. And there'll be an opportunity for everyone to break off and discuss, and just some prompting questions here for you, right? So when we read about a case, could this have happened in our organization? If we think it could have, what do we need to do to make sure it can't or won't or is less likely? How would we respond if it happened within our organization? This third one is a big one for us. You know, as an MSO, we don't have athletes of our own, right, over whom we have direct responsibility. Invariably, we are in a partnering relationship with an NSO, a PSO, a coach. And so we are much more in a position of influence rather than control or authority. And so a lot of the discussions we have is how, or even should, we try to influence what's going on in another organization when we have concerns in this space. And this is where we spend a lot of our time actually when we're discussing cases either in the news or facing us directly. And then I think for those of you who are sport leaders, right, and have organizational structure underneath you, what would our frontline people need to know, and what kind of actions do they need to feel comfortable taking for them to be able to address these issues as they come up, right? And then lastly, what do we do as leaders to ensure that they have those tools and that comfort level? So I'll put this back up when we get to more of the case discussions, but Sandi, perhaps we want to dive in to Mr. Brendan Leipzig. So some of you will remember this situation happened 18 months ago, where a private group chat between Mr. Leipzig and a number of his brother and a few other friends that was wildly misogynistic and some racist comments as well, made its way into the public domain. And there was a lot of discussion about, you know, what was to be done. There were certainly sanctions for him and his brother, I know. And we organizationally were also in the situation where one of the individuals referenced in the text was someone with whom we had a very loose affiliation. And so the question was, what went on? What do we do? How do we respond? And what will we do if this is one of our people? So I know, Sandi, you've reviewed the circumstances here. What were some of your initial thoughts on this case?
When I first looked at it, my only access is through the internet to this, or what appeared in the press, you know. So my first question would be, what do we actually know? And you've said, I think, quite clearly what is known. there's no question about whether the comments were misogynistic or sexist, and harmful to individuals who are easily identifiable and so on. The fact that it's a private conversation and the people in it expected it to remain private raises an ethical issue. So how would you address that? Like it came out through an email address that was then discarded. So what's your thought on that, about how the case comes to the public attention? Does that have anything to do with your thoughts on how this should happen? It's a sample case. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you how we discussed it, right? Is that essentially at that point, the horse was out of the barn. And we certainly, we weren't the entity that disclosed it. And I have to be honest, I don't even know how it did make its way out to the public domain, but nevertheless, it did.
It was anonymously posted.
Yeah, and so having made its way out into the public domain, its impact on real people was real.
Yeah.
And we have, so, the conversation that we had internally was, we have this loose affiliation with one of the identified individuals. Moreover, it's clearly sport related. Our particular athlete population skews female, right? It's pretty reasonable to think that there will be, or will have been, or will be in the future, some online misogynistic abuse directed towards one or more of the female athletes that work with us.
For sure.
So what would we do if this was not someone we had a loose affiliation with, but someone we had a very close affiliation with, as an example? And how, or what is our role in that moment to make a statement or not about what we've heard?
So the Washington Capitals, who were the ones who had the direct relationship with Brendan, and 2 days after this was released, they let him go. So they placed him on unconditional waivers, which is essentially like, okay, anybody can have him. He'd only been on contract a few months. He wasn't even through, I don't think, his first year. So their response was to make an immediate statement by dropping the hammer on him.
Well, and so this is the interesting one, and you've referenced a little bit on the performance side, right? Is how much do we tolerate for somebody who wins? So he was at this point in his career was a marginal fourth line. He was a marginal NHLer at this stage, right? So relatively easy for an organization to cut him. But what if this is one of your star performers, right? Either as a staff member or as an athlete or as a coach, which is where we see it fairly often. How do we as leaders, because we certainly make accommodations for our stars in many walks of life, and how do we decide where that line is, right? And so this might be a question you might pose to your group
well, the question is the Washington Capitals action a way of acting according to policy and principle, or is it about controlling reputational damage? And could be either of those things, and they may not be exclusive.
Yeah, and the other one that we talk about a lot is, so how might we influence, right? So his brother was on this chat. His brother played for the University of Manitoba hockey team at the time, and they also declined to allow him to continue his participation on that team. But do we have any public role? I know I reached out to the athletic director after this case and after that announcement was made, and we had a bit of a conversation about how they made that decision, which was useful for me, right, to hear their thought process as well. And I think that we cannot be shy to reach out and ask people who have been through some of these circumstances, right? How did that set of machinations and thought processes go for you?
And to offer support. I mean, one of your actions then, whether you would call it that, is to mentor, given that you've got a lot of experience in the area now, to mentor where you can, and to offer some educational opportunities where you can, and to partner where you can, like to spread the load out. And okay, what about another one of the hockey coaches, an AA hockey coach, said that this might be all solved on the gridiron. He said, in all reality, it might all be solved on the gridiron. What do you think of that?
So I hadn't seen that quote. I mean, I sort of take that to mean we'll go out to the parking lot and settle it. Is that kind of the interpretation? Yeah. So I mean, that strikes me as the kind of thing that should be strongly denounced in this day and age, right? Like this is not a two wrongs make a right situation that we all learned in kindergarten.
Yeah, good. Violence against violence.
Yeah. You know, the other piece of this, and we actually touched on it, was the whole social media piece, right? It was one of the sessions earlier. And, you know, the fact of the matter is I would even argue within our staff, there's a bit of a generational shift in how people, like the mode or the medium over which people want to communicate, right? Like I think about some of our younger practitioners who are very savvy on social media and, you know, and do connect with athletes. And it's a very effective medium of communication. But it does also open up some organizational and some interpersonal risks that I think it's our job to make sure that we are making staff aware of.
Yeah. Well,
right?
It's interesting you brought that up because all of the players have had training in this area.
Right.
Right. They all had the training. They all knew what they were supposed to do. They had all probably signed a code of ethics or something like that. I don't know exactly how they managed that part, but everyone had received training. But clearly that doesn't have much to do with the attitudes that they have. And
well, I'm sorry, Sandi.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so this is a pet cause of mine that training. There is a lot of training out there that, in my view, might be a little bit more an exercise in box ticking rather than effective education for learning and behavioral change. And so the Center for Child Protection is not paying me to say this, but the Commit to Kids modules, as an example, they are heavy. The content is heavy, but I can't imagine anyone leaving those modules without having been impacted by them.
Yeah. And
I can think of other obligatory trainings that I have taken. So for those of you in Manitoba, you'll be aware that you know, the respect modules are one of the kind of baseline training requirements for coaches. Hockey uses it a lot. I have wondered whether they have the impact that they might wish they would have, as an example, right? So when we are doing training, and for federally funded organizations, it is a requirement that you do training in safe sport right now. Are we doing training that is genuinely effective and that changes behaviors and that is truly educational? Or are we doing training that allows us to report back to Sport Canada saying we did training?
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, I echo your concerns. The best training I've ever had in the area is based on it's relational training. It's interactive and you learn from each other, and you may not have an expert in the room even. You know, it is about everybody trying to sort through and struggling through with, as you said, the language and the right direction to face on an issue and so on. But it's an iterative, it's a give and take kind of process that gets you there. And so the tick box kind of programs fill a baseline, but by no means answer the questions that an individual might have when they're even beginning such training. Like there's no room for those kinds of things. Yeah. So I would say one of the really good outcomes could be that that organizations look at the training they have and try and build in relational aspects, as your own case, you know, has done. You've done that brilliantly.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. I want to move on and give everyone an opportunity to discuss in smaller groups some of these cases that we've got coming. But I think you're absolutely right that it's the interplay of, you know, the formal training. So this is Gretchen Kerr coming on for the first session and really helping defining some terms and some rationale behind the UCC MS. And then it's, okay, how can we as a staff, as a team, as a whomever, take those terms and build them into our own lexicon and our own day-to-day operations, right? Is, I think, the really effective way to go about doing this. So
I have one more thing to say about the case that we're talking about. One of the women who was described in misogynist terms and so on turned it into a positive opportunity to raise body positivity issues. And she'd already been doing that quite a lot in the media. And so she carried on, but with the added impetus for having been targeted for some of the work that she was doing. So she became, rather than say, I feel really badly about this, I feel wounded, all of that, which I'm sure she did. She also took it and it enabled her to move forward a little bit. So that was quite instructive for me. I was very proud to see someone be sort of media courageous in the face of stuff like that. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, why don't we move on? And Sandi, do you just want to present the case? And so what we'll do is Sandi will present it. Jesse has got everyone ready to go into some breakout rooms. And I think the opportunity here is just to discuss what issues do you see raised here? How might this impact, or how might a similar case impact your organization? What could you do to prevent it or minimize the impacts? Just tear it apart a little bit, get comfortable with the language. That's what we're hoping to promote here. And then we'll bring everyone back. We'll have a quick roundtable for takeaways, observations, key points, and then we'll take another crack at it to finish off.
Okay. So these two cases, both of them come out of the Sheldon report in the UK, which focused on boys. But in this one, his title for the section was "Why Certain Boys Are Targeted." He said a number of survivors explained to the review that he was doing this review of 30 years of abuse in football, that they felt they were targeted because they were from less privileged families. And there's some evidence of that. Some abusers would exploit the fact that some parents could not take boys to training or games, and thus providing an opportunity for someone else to step in and do those things. So you can see where that might go. Some abusers gave children, and in some instances their parents, things that encouraged familiarity between the abuser, the eventual abuser, and the children. And look at, so for the treats, it was meals, meals out, takeaway food, football kit, that's the uniforms and stuff, days out, like pulling them out of school for a day for extra training practice, holidays in the UK and even overseas. Like the abuser, eventual abuser, would take the kids out that the parents couldn't possibly afford. A number of survivors felt that they were targeted because they were from a single parent family, typically a single parent, mother-headed family, or because their parents were not as attentive as other parents might be. Okay, so that's the scenario. See what you can find in there and see what, if this were happening around you, what you or your organization might begin to do about it.
Yeah, thanks, Sandi. So Jesse, when we will set the clocks at 8 minutes, and if each individual group could consider appointing someone to just share a thought or two, that would be wonderful. So Jesse, you'll send us off to our various breakout rooms. So I hope there were some good discussions in your various groups. Jesse, I'm not sure the best way to manage this, maybe with a raised hand. Is there anyone that felt that there was a point that was of particular interest they wanted to raise, a question that came up that they'd like the larger group to discuss?
Yeah, you can either raise your hand or unmute, whatever you'd like here.
I'm unmuting myself. Hi. We had a question in our group because the situation that you gave us, we weren't exactly sure what we should be discussing, but we did discuss the fact that those situations that had come up were completely inappropriate. However, there could be the case where, you know, someone was genuinely kind and athletes needed to be driven to their practices and things like that have occurred. I was saying myself as a coach, I've at one time picked up 5 of my athletes to bring them to and from practice, which now you can't do. So we had sort of discussed that if things that were in place, like the coach expectations and suitable behavior and appropriate behavior, if that had been in place, a list of what was appropriate and what was not, and the coach was aware of that, and the families were aware of that, and the athletes were aware of that, this never would have happened, regardless of good intentions or not. If everyone had been made aware, the athlete themselves would not be in a situation after where they would have said, oh, you know, I think that I was targeted because I was underprivileged. They would have said right off the get-go, this is not right, right? I know, you know, it's nice that you want to take me for dinner, but I know that I'm not allowed to because of this contract or whatever, what's appropriate and what's not. So that's sort of what we discussed at our group. And that, yes, there's definitely people that are kind and want to, you know, help the underprivileged athlete and help them either get to the practice or provide equipment or whatever, but that's just not appropriate. That's what we discussed.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because we can't pretend that unusual or emergency situations don't come up, right? You know, there isn't really an option to leave a child at a facility overnight because mom and dad happen not to be able to get there, right? And so the next level of the conversation, my suggestion would be is, okay, in those unusual circumstances, what additional protections might we put in place to protect both coach or you know, non-custodial parent or whatever it is, and athlete, right? What other communication mechanisms we have in place? Are there other things that we can do in those unusual one-offs that we can't possibly foresee in every policy document? Right? Any other thoughts, observations that came up? Adrian, I see you dying to get in here.
No, I was just going to say that's where I found the child protection training so incredibly helpful, because they had specific strategies for that. So they said, if you are driving someone home, someone should know that you are driving that child home. And so as the coach driving that person home, you should tell someone else on your staff for the protection of both yourself and that athlete. And so things like that were not anything that I would have thought of necessarily. And it made sense to me as soon as I read it. And so I do think that that's excellent training. I would also say in our group, we had Michael, and Michael's a retired 28-year police officer. So he had some, you know, he saw the world a bit differently than my naive interpretation of the world, where I said we're totally the opposite. I'm like an overly trusting person, whereas he, you know, you have to prove your trust for him. So the things in that child protection document, he worked a lot in the child abuse area. And so he's, for anyone working in sport, you know, he's a great resource in terms of helping you see the other side and some of the policies you should have in place. But that's excellent training. So for anyone looking to do it, you know, do things in a way that make both, you know, make sense in both fashions, I would highly recommend that training as well.
Yeah, good. Marisha, Gina, anything that you want to share from our all too brief discussion?
Well, I think we were, you know, because this is beyond policy, right? So you have the policies in place, and then how do you make them come alive? How do you make them be actions, not just words on the paper? And so, you know, in my mind, when you presented that scenario, because we're talking about soccer, football, it's like, well, you know, like in my experience, I've done some safe sport investigations, particularly in soccer, and you know, I can say in my background, I don't come from such highly regulated sport background, swimming and paddling and rowing. You know, it's a little bit more, oh, it's you know, stuff's going on, we can have practice. Whereas soccer, it's like regimented, and you have so many practices, and you're doing this and this and this. And what I found there as a good practice in soccer was that the coach with support of the club would have an opening meeting, right? And as much as possible, there would be parents and athletes and the coach and the den mother is what they called them, the people who were like around the change rooms and stuff. And so you get everybody as much as possible. It's never going to be perfect, but you get them together, and so that you can lay out the ground rules and communicate them, right? And say, this is how we do things. And if it is about, if a parent is going to carpool kids, then we know who's carpooling someone where, right? And this is why. And I think as adults, sometimes people see these rules maybe, and it doesn't kind of make sense to them. So if you get to the why are we doing this, we're creating a safe environment for everybody, not and the coach, the kids, the parents, everybody. This is why we're doing it. I think that communication piece, and to keep reiterating it, have that consistent messaging, I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what you're saying, Marisha, about the regularity of it, right? It can't be one-off, and expect that you've disseminated a message and it's part of your organizational culture.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
I guess one other thing too, it just occurred to me, is like one of the follow throughs is that the parents and the parents and the athlete would sign a contract, right? To say, I understand, I've read it, I understand this is what we're agreeing to do. We're agreeing, this is our commitment to abiding by these rules within the club. So maybe that's getting too much into the policy piece, but I think, that having a parent and child sign a document together, you would hope that it would create some opportunity for dialogue between the parent and the child to say, yeah, this is why we're doing this. This is what's good. This is what's on. This is what's not on. So.
Actually, Marisha, oh, sorry, Sandi, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute, Sandi.
Yeah. Megan and Francesca and I were in a group, and one of the first things that came out was that not everyone is on the same level of being able to talk about this. So the sport organizations may be at a higher level than virtually anybody else who wants to talk about these issues, the parents and the children included, and the nefarious, in this case, talent scout. Another thing that came out is if it is about economic disadvantage, then whenever we have programs that are populated by kids who have some of this economic disadvantage, it behooves us to have extra eyes on it, extra risk assessment, extra programming, those kinds of things, so that they are more than safe in sport, rather than we hope they're safe in sport. It's that, starting from the margins in, right? It's one of those, if you focus on that as your baseline, then you're going to do quite well.
It also kind of occurs, sorry, Allison, hearing Marisha talk about the conduct and stuff, it reminded me of one of the earlier speakers in the series mentioned about how we have coaches code of conduct, or we have athlete code of conduct, but we don't actually share that we have it, and or don't share what's in it. So for me as a coach, and this just came to mind 30 seconds ago, to invite that feedback from my athletes sooner than later. Hey, here is what I have agreed to, NCCP code of conduct, my National Sport Organization code of conduct. Let me know how I'm doing with this. And I mean, older athletes, younger athletes, you'd have to change your language and your invitation there, but and prompting that and actively seeking it out, instead of just simply, let me know how I'm doing at the end of the year, but hey, Marisha, I'm trying to work on this. What do you think? How did I do here? Or if it's a parent to coach conversation or something like that, to set that tone and start that and invite that, to then make it a bit more commonplace for people to feel comfortable saying, Jeff, you really sucked the big one last week. Yeah, sorry, Megan, I know.
I get plenty of that feedback, I can tell you.
You saw that too, eh?
I felt safe saying that about you, Jeff. Thank you.
No, that's great. Sorry, Allison, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I actually had to go through the code of conduct. My daughter figure skates, and they made us go through, the club made us go through the code of conduct. and go through it step by step. It was probably a 45-minute long Zoom call like this, where we sat with our athlete, our daughter, and my daughter was 11 at the time, and went through about appropriate behaviors, not appropriate behaviors, the whole policy, and do you understand this? So, and that was the point. It was amazing. It was so amazing that they didn't just, like on every other thing, you click the click box, and I could have that discussion with my daughter after the fact or during the fact. You didn't have to sign it that day, but they took you through the policy and made sure that you as a parent understood what you are agreeing to, and made the athlete aware of what I'm signing off on their behalf, right? And having that discussion, like, so do you understand what this means? And if this happens to you, and having that, it's huge that you can have that conversation with your child. And the only thing that I'm a little, that's in a, I don't want to put this in the wrong way, but in figure skating is a smaller sport. It's more contained. I'm not going to have my daughter take the bus. It's a more expensive sport, right? So I'm not going to have her take the bus maybe to get to the practice. So something like soccer, where it's, kids are just walking to the practice and not maybe the parents aren't involved in the sport itself. They sign them up, and then they're like, go. Getting that participation on a code of conduct, going through it like that may not be realistic. But if you're expecting them to play, I think it's a huge opportunity to have everyone be more educated and realizing what they're signing before, rather than just ticking a box, like you said.
So Alison, here's a question for you: was that discussion revisited in other ways throughout the year? Or was it really at the jumping off point?
No, it was at the jumping off point, to make sure that everyone understood what was in the policy and what they were signing when. And it was just that one. It was this past fall that we started it. So I don't know whether or not that would be an annual thing that they would have everyone go through. But they had different set times. I think there was 4 or 5 different Zoom calls. You signed up for whichever one you could make. And it was everyone from national athletes, like national competitive athletes, to just star one competitive, like just starting out, right? So
I just wonder about coaches, revisiting it. It doesn't need to be a great big long thing, but just touching it, periodically throughout the year, just to keep it live, rather than something we do and then put to rest.
Yeah, that was just the club itself. It wasn't a coach with their athletes per se. I think that would have been amazing if the coaches sort of went through, like you say, Megan, about talking to your athletes about, this is what I've agreed to. I want you guys to give me some feedback as we go, or maybe do like a questionnaire or a report card, or, just the way you give them feedback, for them to give you feedback as a coach, at a certain level, or the parent, if there's anything, like having that open dialogue. Would be amazing.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I can speak to that from a figure skating coach, that we do annually have to work through that as a coach, as part of our certification. It's something that we actively participate with. And then there's tools for us to take through with our athletes as well, throughout the season. So that's awesome to hear, Alison.
Perfect. Good. Now, we had prepared another case to go through a similar set of discussions. I'm certainly more than happy to give everyone that opportunity, although I appreciate that some of you are getting a little late in the day, and you may have had a long day. So I'm quite happy to take the direction of the group here. Jesse, can we just use the reactions for little thumbs up if people want to carry on, and then maybe the celebration button saying no thank you, it's time for drinks. And then we'll certainly provide the deck, the case, both the descriptor, and Sandi's also provided the where you can go and find the entire report as well. So we would certainly share that if you want to examine it, discuss it with your teams afterwards. Is that a fair way to decide our way forward here for the group? Okay.
Yeah, Marisha wants to party.
Yeah. Okay. So just as I'm seeing a few things come in, I think there might be a bit of a mixed bag, and I certainly don't want to force anyone's hand here. Perhaps what we'll do is I am certainly more than happy to make myself available for any conversations outside of this. Although I am still very much, I think, a neophyte in this. Sandi is the expert. But I
would make myself available as well. I mean, we were a team on this one, so.
Yeah, so if there's anyone that wants to follow up on any of these, by all means, Jesse, when you share the materials, you'll share our contact information, please?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I don't know, Jesse, are you doing the big windup or am I?
Can I add one thing before we wind up?
Yeah, please.
I found this really instructive. It's the first time I've used readiness, and it seems to resonate quite well. I'm very pleased with that. But also we had 5 or 6 other cases that I had drafted, and Jeff and I discussed which ones to bring forward. I can make that deck of 6 available. They're all well cited, so you know, they're perfectly legitimate for you to use. If they would help with discussions that you want to have with the people around you. I could just make sure that Jesse gets that out to you as well.
Of course, Francesca, you have a question there?
Yeah, Sandi jumped in, so then I was like, well, maybe I'll ask my question before everyone disperses. The conversation that was being had about coaches and clubs taking the onus of, or not the onus, but the proactivity of basically showing the code of conduct. We have a lot of master service agreement holders or contractors, and we service a lot of coaches where I get the sense that a lot of their time is kind of voluntary and or they're being paid for a very specific thing. So then when it comes to implementing safe sport or taking training or professional development or anything to that degree, it seems like that's voluntary and above and beyond what the expectation might be. So I'm just wondering if anyone, I know there was some individuals who spoke about coaching and doing proactive steps with safe sport, if anyone has any take on that of kind of how to navigate the importance of this, but balancing it with knowing that there are volunteers in this space too. Maybe there's no actual answer, just something I wanted to to ask if anyone had anything.
Well, I do. Can I step in? Just, there is a bit of an answer, and that is that if you want what's best for your athletes, then you have to find time for the things that are best for your athletes. And this is one of them. And presented in that kind of, it's not one more thing that they have to do. In fact, it's the foundation for a lot of the things they do, and they will be able to do better. It's that kind of thinking. So whether they're volunteer or paid, for me, is a little bit irrelevant. It's an essential part of how good coaching is to occur in the future. So maybe that kind of thinking will be motivational. Maybe.
I think this does touch on the capacity constraint that you identified the other day, Sandi, both within organizations, but even for individuals. I mean, Gina, you might be able to speak to this, but what we ask of coaches right now is extraordinary, right? In terms of the technical requirements for NCCP and this, and they have to be administrators. And, you know, I mean, I am sympathetic that the load on coaches and the eye that is being placed on coaches is a load right now. And I think as sport administrators, we need to be really thoughtful about how can we get, 90 or 100% of the effectiveness in 20% of the time. I mean, I don't know what the percentages are, right? But be much more efficient with our communication of these messages and the learning. Gina, do you have any ideas on how to help coaches in this space?
I kind of describe here
is that sorry Gina, I always want to wait because I'm never sure if it's my connection. You're a little choppy. I don't know if there's we appreciate the intention. How about
if you turn off your camera, it might give you some extra bandwidth for your sound.
Afraid not, Gina. Sorry.
I mean, one thing to think about might be integrated coaching training. Like right now we have a module, you know, and they go on ad infinitum, is trying to get safeguarding into every single module. A little bit every time. That might be very helpful.
Actually, as you say that, Sandy, that safeguarding series that we were on, Algeria, the Algerian Rowing Federation.
Yeah.
I was really struck that they had integrated safe sport language into their officials development, into their rules of racing, and it touched every element of the organization, right? So there was, back to your specific question is, if when they are taking their technical training, which they would have to take anyway, there is a safe sport element to it, does that allow you to kill two birds with one stone?
Yeah.
You know, and in the same hour of training.
So it is foundational, you know, that idea that it is foundational. It's part of what good coaching is about all across the board. Yeah, I think I was struck by that as well. Yeah. Very good.
I was going to say for Francesca, if I don't know what organization or what sports you're in, but making it maybe not mandatory, but saying, you know, even for volunteer coaches, right? For me coaching my son's soccer, I have to take, you know, respect in sport, and I have to make sure that I've done, because I'm in a position of trust, and everyone has to make sure that I'm going to do what I'm supposed to be doing and doing it well and looking after the safety of the children. So same thing, it doesn't matter, you know, even if you're a volunteer, some people are going to say, oh, I don't want to do that, or, you know, but really it's about the safety of the kids. And if even if they're willing to do it, usually they can do different training without having to break the bank, or maybe not for, like, because there is a lot of free material out there too. And if they can access any of that, or making it sort of mandatory at like that level, at the higher level where we're choosing the volunteer coaches, then, you know, you don't, rather than saying asking, like you'd like them to do it on their own, but sometimes you have to say, well, no, you have to do this.
Yeah. Okay. I want to be conscious of everyone's time, and you've all committed so much over the last couple of weeks, and I want to say thank you for your attention and your care and your consideration to this topic. I think it's critically important. I mean, Adrian, Jesse, and I, we talk with our group all the time about we're a little bit beholden to the sports system that exists beneath us, the development system that exists beneath us for the athletes that walk through our door on any given day, and the importance that there are more people participating, and they are doing so in healthy, positive environments is critical to the work that we do. And I think it's critical to the work that we all do. And for us to have the kind of system where all participants have the experiences that we wish that they would have, this is critical. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you devoting your time to trying to get better at it and learn more about it. So thank you very much. Jesse, you'll share any administrative items come out of this?
Yes, I will pass all that along tomorrow with the recording, any of the resources we discussed here, and then you guys will provide me with your slides and everything. But yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon.
Good night.